Hello, this is Aaron Wissner of Local Future, and I'm here on the line live with Steve Keen from Thailand and Nicole Foss from New Zealand. How are you two doing today?
I'm doing
very
well.
We're both discussing we're lucky to be in COVID-free countries, which puts us in a better situation than you, Aaron.
Yes, well, as a matter of fact, today's June the 1st, 2020, and about 11 in the morning today, the governor came up on Facebook, a live broadcast, and she said, the stay-at-home order is lifted, and everybody can go out again. Except apparently some things there's still restrictions, like if you go to the barber shop, there can be only like one person in there, and so it's lifted, but it's not like back to normal. So
not by a long shot. You guys, yeah.
So
I think you're in for a second wave.
Steve and Nicole, do you just want to introduce yourself with like a 1 or 2 line? Nicole.
Okay, my name is Nicole Foss. I'm a futurist, if you like, or a crystal ball gazer, or a freelance academic, however you care to put it. So my quest in life is to find the biggest possible big picture, to look at different subsets of reality, as many of them as I can manage, and integrate them all into a big picture of how the world works and where we go from here.
Okay, well, I'm a professor of economics, retired but still active, and my main focus has been on demolishing the nonsense that passes for mainstream economics in my book, which you can see the cover of over there, Debunking Economics. And my main focus is on mathematical models of financial instability and modeling capitalism as a monetary, unstable, dynamic system, which is what it is, as opposed to the mythology of neoclassical economics that sees it as a barter system in or near equilibrium.
Okay, so I have a short story to tell you, and then I'd like your reflection on it, if you would be so kind. But before I do that, it is 9:30 p.m. here on Monday. How much time do we have together? I think Nicole said she could be here for like an hour or 2, but Steve, I know your time is tight.
About an hour will do me. I've got some papers to write that I've got to get onto.
Got it. 60 minutes on the clock. Okay, so today I got this friend request on my Facebook, and it was from this young African woman, and I was like, who is this person friend requesting me? And so I started chatting with her, and apparently she read this article I'd written about George being murdered in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and where there was the guy who was standing on his neck with his knee. That guy, police officer, and apparently there's 3 other police officers standing there, and then there were some other people standing there, but they threatened him with mace or something. Anyway, she'd read that article.
Yeah, Derek Chauvin is the one who's been arrested.
Say that again.
Derek Chauvin is the one who's been arrested, but there's 3 others who were complicit who may yet be arrested at some point down the line.
Are they the ones that just stood there?
Yes.
Okay. So anyways, I had been talking with my 12-year-old, 13 almost, about the story. I kind of made it really generic though, because my 10-year-old was listening, and I didn't say that there was police officers, and I said there was only one bystander, and I was imagining it was one of the police officers, like his partner. And yeah, we had this whole little chat about what the bystander should have done, and my son was quite insistent that even if he was going to be possibly shot, that the bystander's responsibility was to push the guy off, like actually physically push him or beat on him or twist his arm or break his wrist or something. And that by standing there, he was more complicit because he was just standing there. Do you have a reaction to that?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, a lot of kids are really idealistic, and they do have a real strong sense of fairness and things, and they do want to intervene if they see a situation that's unfair. I don't think he realizes just what exactly would happen to him if he did that. It probably wouldn't be very pleasant. But it's good to see that he does care, and that he really has a sense of responsibility and duty, because I think kids have that naturally, or at least a lot of them do.
And in legal terms, those police standing nearby were certainly complicit in manslaughter and potentially complicit in murder.
In what way?
Well, because if you can see that somebody is being killed, and you are not doing anything to prevent that, and you're in a position to do so, and they are police officers, they could have told the other guy simply to stop. They could have pulled their guns on him. They could have pushed him, just like your child said. And in those situations, by not doing it, they're certainly complicit in what could be called second-degree murder, certainly in manslaughter.
Yeah, I would say at the absolute minimum, it would be second-degree murder for the person who did it, and manslaughter for the others at the absolute minimum. And you could make a case for something more significant than that. Depends if you can prove intent. That's what it really comes down to.
Yeah, yeah.
So that plays into this 25-year-old African woman from Ghana. Apparently she read, I wrote that up, what my son and I had talked about. I shared it with the local publisher. He published it on this rinky-dinky little paper. Somehow she found it from the BBC. Somebody had reposted it, and she read it, and she was like, oh, that's interesting. So she friend requests me. And then, so I was like, not sure, because I'd never heard of her before. I don't have any friends in Africa at all that I know of. And, but we got to talking, and we went on the Zoom. And then I was very curious about, because when I visualize Africa, I often visualize a very poor country as far as the people have very little. They might have a house, but the house is very simply decorated. And it was nighttime for her, so she couldn't take me around during the Zoom, but I took her around my house, and she was just, her dad's a banker. So they're well off. She said they're like 90 percentile. But she was just like shocked by all the stuff in this house. And this house isn't particularly, it's like a $200,000 house, you know, and it's got maybe $100,000 in contents. So it's, you know, I'm old, I'm 50, you know, so, but I mean, I said, you know, are there people in Ghana that have houses like this? And she said, no. I mean, the only person that would have stuff like that with a park outside, she said it was a park because it was a mowed lawn, like half an acre on each side. With a playground, it's just like a swing set, you know, with a garden. And we've got a couple of gardens that we're growing stuff in. She said only the president would have a place like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if we can talk about income inequality and how did income equality get like this?
You want to go first, Steve?
I'll let you go first then, Nicole.
Okay. Well, I mean, when you have a bubble, every single time in history there's been a bubble, you get towards the peak of a bubble, you get increasing returns to capital and decreasing returns to labor. And it becomes less and less stable until you eventually reach a peak. And a peak is usually, it's the point where you can't find a greater fool. So you can always sell something at any price if there's a greater fool. But eventually you reach the greatest fool, and there's nobody who will pay more for an asset than that. And then at that point, you shift into the other direction. You've just reached the top, and we're so overvalued right now. The markets are ridiculously overvalued, and they really are going to have the mother of all collapses at some point. So I very much see this as an impending Minsky moment, which is very much the way that I would understand that you would see it as well. When the markets have gone to the point where you've gone so far beyond what debt was originally for. Debt is supposed to be self-liquidating. You're supposed to borrow money in order to start a business that will produce an income stream that will allow you to pay down the debt that you just took on to do it. This is the good kind of debt that greases the wheels of an economy. But we went way beyond that, and we started borrowing money for pure consumption. And then we started borrowing money to gamble on asset price appreciation, which is what we've been doing for a very long time now. It's pure gambling. People are chasing momentum. Most people don't have the faintest idea what the fundamentals even are. They're just chasing momentum, thinking, well, this is going up. Somebody must know what they're doing, so I'm going to jump on this particular bandwagon. And what people often do is jump on the bandwagon towards the end. But when you've got, as you do now, the vast majority of the people all on one side of the bet, take the other side of the bet. You have to be a contrarian at times like this. So the market is going to go into a phase of extreme volatility over the next while. We've already seen some of that. So we saw the enormous fall from March, and it's been going up since. But we really are going to start to see this enormous amount of volatility. That's what happens when fear is in control of the markets. And that's very much what we're going to see. And initially, the inequality, the bursting of a bubble, because what you find is that the people who still had managed to preserve capital as liquidity will buy up everybody else's assets at distressed prices for pennies on the dollar, and you get in an extreme of resource ownership concentration. But then over time, you will find that those people will end up on the wrong end of a pitchfork. You have a revolution because that level of inequality is absolutely unsustainable. So we've been through this cycle many, many times before in human history. I expect it'll be a while before we actually get to that point, but I expect a lot of unrest before then, and that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Okay, I'll talk a bit of background context and a bit of data on that front as well. Mm-hmm. The inequality is almost a natural outgrowing of an exchange economy of any description. Just imagine having a random set of exchanges between people, randomly distributed. You will get what's called a Boltzmann distribution, or a power law distribution of wealth from the most extreme to the smallest. That's inevitable in any society. So inequality is enormous. What Nicole's talking about, I want to put some context on by showing you a chart about the level of. Okay, Aaron, you have to enable host sharing so I can show what I want to show on my screen. Can you do that? Allow me to share my screen.
The call dropped for just a second, so enable participants. Is there, Steve? I want to do this as a podcast, though. Also, is there any way you can do it without the slides? So that, because people listening to the podcast,
I can talk once I've got the slide on. Yeah, I can talk once I've got the slide up there and give the data verbally, but it's better if you have visual as well. It helps to have both.
I agree.
Okay. I can't see either one of you, so if you can double check your cameras on, that would be great.
Yeah, the cameras are on. Extreme level of private debt we're experiencing right now. This is, for those who can't be listening to the podcast, I'll try to verbally describe it. This is a chart showing the level of private debt in America and the level of credit, which is the annual. Well, I just find credit as the change in debt, and that's what finances spending, which is what gives us a boom when debt is rising and a bust when debt starts to fall. And if you take a look at the data, you can see there are three major peaks in the level of private debt in America. Way back in 1837, when it was 65% of GDP, during the Great Depression, when it was 144% of GDP, and at the peak, what we call the Great Recession back in 2008, when 170% of GDP. Now, after those peaks, you had falling levels of credit, falling levels of debt rather. So back in 1836, 37, it fell. And well, I didn't know that this crisis occurred until I plotted this data, and I went back and looked at the Wikipedia and library books and found what's called the Panic of 1837, which was described as the greatest economic crisis in the history of capitalism up until that time. And that had a period of about 8 years when there was negative credit. The Great Depression comes along, actually not as severe as the 1837 crisis, but the same basic story. After the bubble, the bust with negative credit for about 8 years, and that's what led to both Hitler, the Second World War, etc., etc. We are now starting the current crisis with a high level of private debt than occurred during the Great Depression. Our level, even though it's fallen from the peak, is 150% of GDP. The peak during the Great and as it's happening at the same time, health. So yeah, we've done a brilliant job of stuffing ourselves up completely. And I think I don't expect the usual stock market bust to come out of this because the Federal Reserve is supporting and pumping up the market. But we're in for the greatest of all social busts and environmental busts in the next 10 years. Okay, that's my bit done. You're muted, Aaron.
Yep. So tell me about Ghana versus the U.S. I mean, what's really going on? I mean, in layman's terms, why is the president live in a house that is no more opulent than my?
You're breaking up, Aaron. Your voice was breaking up. I didn't understand that.
Okay, just a second.
It could be that the weather is affecting his internet, because when I was living in a rural area in Canada, it used to really affect my internet very badly.
Oh, right. Okay.
Doesn't seem to here, but here we have fiber.
Again, New Zealand is better than Australia on that front. Okay, Aaron, you're back, and you're back twice. What's going on here? This is rather funny.
We can see you from the front and the back.
That must be the same. Okay, we've got a Zoom background on one, do we? Okay, Aaron, you're asking a question about Ghana. Aaron, we can't hear you. You're muted again.
Funny when you can see the front and the back of somebody's head at the same time.
How is it? I'm trying to make this work here. How is it that my house in the USA and a lot of people's houses in the USA are as opulent as a presidential house in a African country?
It's partly that there's a lot of space. So, I mean, in Europe, for instance, in England, you don't tend to have houses like you would have in the US, because there just isn't enough land. You ordinary people wouldn't be able to afford enough land to build a big house like that. But yeah, Canada and the US, people tend to build McMansions. They're absolutely enormous houses, far bigger than people need. I mean, my sister's old house, it was so big that you needed 2 furnaces to heat it, which I just thought was extremely excessive. But here in New Zealand, houses are smaller, and they're all different as well, because everything is built on hillsides. So you can't have cookie cutter suburbs. You have to have everything different, because every lot is different from every other lot. But houses are a more sensible size here in general than they are in the States. They're far more expensive though.
And of course, we have to throw in colonialism, the effective rape of Africa by colonial powers, the devastation that did to their economies. Okay. Aaron, you know, you're muting yourself again. If you're asking a question, we can't hear you.
What do you mean rape of Africa? I mean, this is not something that I think anyone...
Oh, come on.
I don't think any one of my friends who might be watching this knows what you're talking about. And we're...
I think we have kidding. Pardon the French, but you are fucking kidding. No. Why do you think the Black Americans came from?
Aaron knows. Aaron knows. He's just saying it is common knowledge.
Your friends. My God.
I went to a real. Of course, I went to a real school in a real rural place, and I have real friends that live in the real world. So.
And they don't know about slavery. They don't realize where the Black Americans came from.
Well, they know about that, sure. They know about that, sure. But I think they would think, well, that was just moving people from one place to another.
Oh, God almighty. Where do you begin? I mean, the America's ignorance about itself and the rest of the planet is just breathtaking to a non-American, frankly. Yeah, I mean, the colonial powers, which of course predating America, go back to the Dutch and the English, the Portuguese, the Spanish, all invaded Africa at various times and took away their people. You had various African tribes selling members of other African tribes as well, of course. There was a fair bit of complicity going on. but that devastated the social and economic structures of Africa starting about 300 years ago. And then you had the serious colonial period, which began in the sort of early 1800s, with Germany getting into the act as well and trying to divide up and conquer and control Africa. Then the American slave trade, which began earlier than that. Again, I'm no expert on that. David Graeber would be better to talk about that than me, but that's hundreds of years of slave traders crossing the Atlantic and taking people who'd been captured in Africa and making them indentured labor, first of all under the Spanish and Portuguese and then under the Americans. So it's totally devastating a country, its continent. No wonder it's been pushed back into the literal Stone Age. And if you're trying to grow with that, it's like saying, hey, we're going to compete in a 100-meter race. You've got to start 200 meters back with a ball and chain around your ankle. Good luck. Of course,
I completely agree. I mean, we've been extracting resources, people and physical resources, for the longest time from Africa, and we give them slave labor jobs, and then we dump all the externalities in their countries at the same time. So they get to do all the hard work for basically none of the benefit, and they get to have all the pollution and things and the social impacts in their country. And we are not developing these countries, we're actively undeveloping them. So the way human systems work is they suck wealth from the periphery to the center. And the so-called developing world is the periphery. We are benefiting while we suck everything from these countries. And we leave these people with failed states, and then we blame them for the fact that they live in a failed state. We also corrupt their leadership. So we bribe the leaders to allow mega corporations from the West to come in and dig things up and remove people, do all kinds of things. And because we have so many of these leaders in our back pockets, or the corporations do, then this is just open season. You can go in and just rape Africa for its resources, not just Africa either. And now China is getting in on the game of colonizing Africa. So they've been doing it economically for a long time. They've taken over from the structural adjustment programs that the US used to implement through the IMF. So China will come along and say, oh, we'll build that road for you, no strings attached. Of course there's strings attached. They're just not quite as obvious as they were with structural adjustment programs. But the third world and the developing world is absolutely still being undeveloped. And the wealth of Africa is ending up in other places. Increasingly, I think it's going to end up in China rather than in the West, but the same process is continuing. And so colonization has been Africa's fate for a very long time. You know, it is not Africa's fault that it's in the state that it's in. It's been interfered with massively for hundreds and hundreds of years by great powers.
It almost sounds like a war, where the war is extracting, like going in and pulling stuff out, like clawing it away or something.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Absolutely. So we get the physical resources, we get all the financial benefit of those physical resources. We pay the people a pittance and use them up, working them in really, really harsh conditions, and all the pollution from whatever process is being engaged in is all dumped in that country as well, usually with no labor standards, no environmental standards. This is why the labor is so much cheaper. I mean, you just don't have standards to protect people or the environment, or health or safety or anything like that. And when you don't have regulations that protect those things, then you don't have the cost of imposing those regulations. So it's an international wage arbitrage that's been going on in the entire era of globalization. Ever since the 1980s, it's been, well, we'll move production to this place because we can pay people less. But there are reasons you pay them less. And it became terribly addictive to offshore manufacturing all over the place. What you've got left in the West is people who make a living taking in each other's laundry, figuratively speaking. So what you call a mature economy, a service economy, is an economy that no longer produces things of value, and its next step is going to be to collapse. So that's pretty much where we are now. And the countries that have developed all the technology transfer and the work ethic from being sweatshops for the West are going to be the next hegemonic powers. So I wrote one of my primers on this, looking at tracing the flow of hegemonic power over time. So you have the rise of a center, then they end up with enough money that they don't want to do the work anymore. So they pay people in the near periphery to do the work for them. The technology transfer ends up there, the money ends up there. So the far periphery is for resource extraction, the near periphery is the sweatshop, but over time, the center will collapse. It will become decadent and collapse, forget how to do things, and a new center will rise in the near periphery. So if you start with Spain, for instance, then Spain was originally the power, then it ended up being England and Holland, which had been Spain's sweatshops. Then from England and Holland, it ended up being America. Now China is America's sweatshop. China will be the next hegemonic power. And we're already seeing that transition now, the transition to power in Asia. They're going to have a lot more control over things than the United States is going to have. But I think we're going to look at a three-way Cold War for a while. So I think China, the US, and Russia are going to be engaged in a replay of the Great Game, which is not going to be very helpful to anybody.
No, I agree, Nicole. This is what I find very discouraging about part of modern monetary theory, if you're aware of that non-orthodox approach to money. They're extremely sensible on money, but they have this nonsense idea about free trade, saying it's actually better to send pieces of paper overseas and get goods back, which has been part of the deconstruction and deindustrialization of America and the growth of China. And I kept my tongue quiet on this particular issue because MMT, it's the first time that you've had a non-orthodox economic theory getting a large amount of public prominence. So I wasn't about to make this critique publicly all the time while that was happening. But now that coronavirus is happening, and one symptom of the coronavirus, of course, is that America can't produce enough face masks, doesn't have enough personal protective equipment. Where is it manufactured? China, Thailand. I haven't got any examples straight in front of me here, unfortunately, but I have about 200 masks that I've bought over here for 20 cents each. Pardon me, I'm sorry, 10 cents each. In locally manufactured N95 masks. Where can't you buy them? America. Why won't we sell them in America? Because we keep them for our own bloody people. We were happy to sell them to America when they weren't essential. Now that they're essential, you guys can cop the coronavirus and we'll remain immune. It's a classic case of a decline of a hegemonic power by outsourcing its manufacturing.
Absolutely. And the more essential goods it outsources, the more vulnerable it is. And the US is incredibly vulnerable right now, because when you have a system that's as efficient as possible, it means there's no fat in the system, and the risk is cascading system failure. If you have a system that has some inefficiency, like Russia did in 1990, for instance, there are ways that you can cushion collapse by dealing with the fat in the system. But if you don't have any fat in the system, then you don't have anything to cushion things with. And so I think the US is far more vulnerable. Dmitry Orlov wrote a series of brilliant essays on this in about 2006. I think there was a set of 3 of them. And then he turned it into a book as well. And it really was very persuasive, looking at how things were quite considerably cushioned in the USSR, because you didn't have a dependence on money, because you didn't have to pay rent, you didn't have to pay utilities. If you weren't being paid at your job, you weren't going to be thrown out on the street, and your gas wasn't going to be cut off. You could go to work and not being paid for months, and it didn't really make that much difference. I mean, you could grow a certain amount of food on your balcony, maybe at your dacha, and people coped, even although the entire food production system, all the collective farms failed, but they fed the population on about 10% of the arable land because people all just did it themselves. And you had a system that could be made to work. I mean, it probably wasn't much fun for people, but they didn't end up rioting. They didn't starve to death. In the States, you have so much more of a dependence on money. If you stop paying people, they're not going to go to work. They can't. They have fixed costs. And so they're going to be doing whatever they can to try and cover those. You're going to see things break down a lot more readily in the States. And it wouldn't surprise me if it happened pretty quickly from here. I mean, you've already got all this rioting that's happening. And from what I hear, you have agents provocateurs all over the place. So it's not even the protesters who are actually starting the violence in a lot of cases. It's being provoked by white supremacists who've been trying to start a civil war for a long time. And this is their opportunity to do exactly that. And
Well,
Trump
I'd like to point out,
encouraging it.
Nicole, I'd like to point out that it's the news organizations like Capital Confidential, which is put out by the Mackinac Center, which is funded by various corporations and also various billionaires, that are organizing this. Like in Michigan, it's, Whitmer must go, or Freedom Michigan. Okay, and that's just in Michigan. So yeah, there's people who are racist, obviously, in the US. There's quite a number of them, but they aren't organizing all this on their own.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is setting up martial law. Trump wants to either cancel or postpone the election. I think that's quite obvious. And I think this is basically a coup. It's a martial law as a prelude to a formal coup. And I think it's possible it might work at this point.
That's quite feasible, unfortunately.
What?
And I very much worry about Canada, because it's a bit like living north of a meth lab.
Have you heard what's the old saying, what borders on insanity?
Mexico and Canada.
Mexico and Canada, yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't get this news in the United States. Apparently, we don't get this news in the United States. Well, especially because when I think of my Facebook feed also, everybody in my Facebook feed lives in the US, if not in Michigan, if not in the community where I live and where I grew up. I mean, other than like this woman from Africa, she's the only person I actually know who other than like the two of you, that actually lives in another country. And you guys are kind of imports. I mean, she actually grew up there. I mean, she grew up in a little village, and her dad grew up in a little village, and they lived in a, very simple house and stuff. And what is a person, what will a person do? What can a person do, no matter where they are in the world? I mean, because this is horrible. This sounds like a horrible thing that's going on. The whole thing sounds horrible. I mean, what should a person do? I mean, I was on the line with another 20-something friend in the middle of the country, and she was, at the rallies this weekend, and they're very peaceful and stuff. But she was explaining how the police officers only seemed to be there to protect the buildings. It's like they weren't even there to protect the people from, the violent intruders that were coming in. And so what are people to do? I'm concerned about the US, but there's a lot more people that are outside the US, like in Africa and India and Brazil.
Yeah, I'm enormously concerned about various places. I'm particularly about India, it must be said. I mean, the population there, I mean, they are going to have so many problems with water and food production. I mean, the glaciers in the Hindu Kush are melting. That's a lot of the water for their agriculture. The monsoon has been shifting, and their water tables are falling by feet per year. So you have to have more and more energy all the time to be able to pump up water from deeper and deeper. At some point, they're not going to be able to do it, and they're not going to be able to feed the people that they have there. Plus, they have a leader who is an extreme Hindu nationalist, and he's encouraging genocide of the hundreds of millions of Muslims that live in India at the moment. I mean, they're being beaten in the streets, their businesses are being destroyed. It's absolutely horrific what's happening in India. I mean, if you think the race riots in the States are bad, India is far, far worse already. I mean, the States is going to get worse from here as well, but India is already there. it's horrific what's happening to Muslims in India.
Yeah, in other words, there's not much individuals can do. I mean, the only thing you can talk about in a situation like this is a form of survivalism. But one of the drawbacks of trying a survivalist approach is you normally need a community to help defend you. If you don't have a community survivalist, you're not going to get very far. So I think the only thing we can really do as individuals is get together and try to turn around the direction of the global economic system. And in some ways, coronavirus is helpful there because it's pointing out very rapidly how we have to do this at a collective level. There's no way that you can fight coronavirus on individual action alone, apart from obviously socially distancing. Well, we should have had the physical, as Nicole was saying earlier, we should have had the slack in the system. That meant we had spare hospital beds, we had spare doctors, we had spare nurses. Lo and behold, we had enough protective equipment for an expansion, for expansion in current medical staff, let alone the current medical staff themselves. All these things are necessary, and they can't be done at a profit. And you have to have state provision of these sorts of public health initiatives, and we haven't had them.
Yeah,
now, the only way you're going
resilience.
to get, sorry?
Redundancy gives you resilience. You have to have spare capacity.
Yeah, you have
if you don't, you will be brittle.
Economic theory emphasizes what they call efficiency and doesn't have any concept whatsoever of what we're calling resilience. Mm-hmm. And to have resilience, you have to have spare capacity. You simply cannot be resilient if 100% of your capacity is currently devoted to what you're doing at the moment. Because as soon as you have to do something else, you have to do less than 100% for your own thing, and you're not even prepared for the extra task that's been thrown at you. And one reason why we're so lacking in resilience this time around is, of course, the accumulation of past mistakes, which is what that level of private debt is all about. So individuals, what you need is individuals to bring about a level of leadership that understands systemic change, challenges, and systemic risk. And if America electing Trump and other countries, people electing like Johnson and so on, we're not being particularly successful at the individual scale, and that's giving us a disaster at the collective level.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, I mean, how to achieve the worst of all possible worlds for your country. I mean, Bolsonaro and Trump are very, very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, both of them seem to have complete contempt for human decency, human life. I mean, they really don't care at all. And both of them just want to consolidate power in order to rule, not to govern. So it's about controlling resources and doling them out in ways that allow you to leverage things for your own benefit. That's absolutely what Trump has been doing all over the place. Wouldn't surprise me at all if Bolsonaro was doing the same kind of thing. But yes, you absolutely have to have central coordination. When you have a disease like this, you have to have more central control temporarily, but that presupposes that your central control will be benign or helpful or something. In a country like the States, if you increased central control, it will be martial law and a right-wing coup. So it's not going to be something that's helpful. It's going to be something that makes things dramatically worse. So I think what we're looking at the moment with all the rioting that's going on is basically a Reichstag fire. So you're having the incidents that are going to lead to the consolidation of power in order to prevent there being an election. So in a country like that, increasing central power is extremely dangerous. To some extent, you have to do it anyway, but it's definitely a dangerous thing. And fortunately, Trump has actually not consolidated power to the extent that he could have done so far. I think he will, but so far he's been trying to avoid responsibility so much that he's actually avoided taking the degree of control that he could have done. Personally, I think that phase is going to end. He's going to be taking considerably more control. He's still going to avoid taking responsibility for anything if he possibly can, but I think he's going to introduce martial law, and people's freedoms are going to be gone. They really are. If people think that people like Gretchen Whitmer were taking away their freedoms in Michigan by asking them to stay at home and watch TV, then they're really not going to like it when the Trump administration comes for all the rest of their freedoms, and not just temporarily either. I think that's going to be a huge, huge problem. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, we have the kind of leadership that, yes, we trust Jacinda Ardern. Yes, you can have all the central power you need because we know you'll get it back at the end of the day. And the whole way she presented it, it was in everybody's interest. We're all doing this together. This is a public good. We're asking everyone to participate for the common good. And that's exactly what happened. And it worked really well. There are a few people who complain about loss of freedom and things, but I think it's a very small minority here at the moment. I think most people absolutely understand what she was trying to do and appreciate how extremely well she did it. So with any luck, if we don't open the borders, we can stay COVID free. But the leadership makes a huge difference. The trust in the leadership makes a huge difference. We trust Jacinda, so we were able to quite happily give her the central powers she needed to deal with the situation. Nobody trusts Trump. So nobody is going to want to give him the central powers that arguably the United States needs. So what you have instead is this patchwork, and you also have a situation where they're not testing because they don't want to know. I think personally they've run out of quite a few of their testing reagents. They don't want to tell people that. So I think this is one of the reasons they're not testing as much as they should. They actually don't have the chemicals that they would need to do that. But they're also lying about the number of cases. They're lying about the number of deaths. So you're getting places like Florida. It's like, all of a sudden, Florida seems to have a pneumonia outbreak. They're not classing it as COVID, but obviously it is. There's a huge peak of excess deaths from pneumonia. And it's clear that these are just mislabeled COVID deaths. You've got
what sort of percentage? What sort of percentage are we talking about? Because Sweden,
I'd have to look it up. I was looking at it this morning. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was on my Twitter feed this morning. I would have to go back and look and see if I can find it. They're not the only ones. I mean, places like Georgia and Florida are right up top there with, if the red states in particular are trying to sort of underestimate their COVID deaths because they want to reopen. So if they're going to reopen, they want to make it seem like it's safe to do so, even although it's obviously not.
It sounds like we're being attacked.
So I think there are going to be huge, huge problems.
It sounds like we're being attacked.
Must be what it feels like.
Like the people, like just the regular working people, it sounds like we're being attacked, not, I mean, in the US, it sounds like we're being attacked, but it sounds like everywhere that people are just being attacked by some enemy. But where's the enemy?
In a way, you could almost say it's like an Atlas Shrugged situation. So you've got a group of wealthy people who are at the moment trying to do their best to shrug off the rest of us because they see us as useless eaters. So I think that is a problem. I'm not saying that they're actively doing anything specific about that at the moment. They could be. I don't know. That's why I'm not saying it. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if they did at some point in the future. Because that's really the way that they see ordinary people, as people for whom there's no purpose in life. There's no reason for these people to exist. There are not enough resources to go around. So they think that if there aren't enough resources for everybody, they want to make sure that they're the ones who get them. And whatever they have to do to prevent other people from taking a share of those resources is something I think they will contemplate. Exactly what that looks like, I couldn't tell you. And that's going to be for the future, I think. And I don't think we're going to like it, is all I would say.
Well, Steve, what are your reflections on this? Because, you know, sometimes people will say that Nicole is kind of a pessimist.
Let's say I'm a kind of a pessimist as well, Aaron. What we're both doing is looking at the normal behavior of human society, which is to ride an unsustainable trend and to be politically committed to continue that trend indefinitely, which by definition can't be done. But those who are riding the wave can never see that it's got any potential to break. Now, I'm focusing these days mainly on the environmental side of that. And if you look at the level of energy consumption that humanity is now undertaking and the level of carbon dioxide pollution that's putting into the atmosphere, then we're on a trend towards raising the temperature of the planet by about 4 degrees, if we're lucky. We talk about these targets of 1.5 degrees, that's out the window, 2 degrees. The momentum that we've already got is going to push us to at least 4. Now, if you look at what scientists say this is the state of the planet at a 4-degree increase in temperature, it's a mass extinction event, and we're going to be part of that. So if you think Nicole's a pessimist, you haven't got me warmed up yet.
There are lots of people more pessimistic than I am. I try to be realistic, but I try to find silver linings where I possibly can, and there are some. I mean, for instance, people will come together in communities in ways they haven't done before because they didn't have to. When they could just come home, shut the door, sit there and watch TV, they followed the path of least resistance without really thinking about it too much. So I think people are going to have every reason to come together and work together because they're not going to have the luxury of just coming home and sitting around and not having to worry about anything. I think there's going to be a lot of risk that people are going to be facing, and people are going to have to know how to deal with that. And it's not something you do by yourself. So I think one really big silver lining is that we will inherently relocalize. We will have to. Society has to simplify. We have no choice in the matter. And so a simpler, more local society, I think, will be a healthier one. I mean, we have to go through an unpleasant transition first, but it's pretty optimistic, I think, to say there's a better world waiting down the line when we do come out the other side of this.
And that's what I'm also focusing on. I mean, I think we're going to go through a hell of a collapse in population. But if we can manage to get to the other side, then we'll never make a mistake like we've made this time round, because the impact of the failure will be ingrained in our species in a way that previous crises, which were always localized, never got ingrained on the species overall. So if we come through it, I think we'll find ourselves deciding we have to be custodians of the planet, not its rapists, which is what we are fundamentally now. The dominant predator, and we behave that way to all other species and to each other. In the aftermath of that, I hope we're going to decide to reserve no more than 20% of the planet for humans' use, and use the other, leave the 80% for the non-human, the wild kingdoms, as we used to call it, and patrol that in such a way that no incursions can occur. We've developed the technology to let ourselves do it. And I hope ultimately we'll get our technology to the stage where we can take production off planet as much as possible and do what we often talk about doing to other planets. That's terraforming Earth, making it back into what it was before we totally industrialized and overloaded its biosystems. So I do see a hopeful future, but I see a very painful transition between where we are now and that hopeful future.
So one thing I'd like to ask you, Steve, is how do you see the energy future? Because from my perspective, I would say that we won't repeat this mistake because we won't be able to, because fossil fuels are a once in a planet's lifetime deal. So I would say we simply won't have the option to rise to the level of complexity that we enjoy at the moment. So from my point of view, I would say that would preclude interstellar travel, or even within the solar system or anything like that. I see a much simpler kind of future where we don't have the option to do these things because they require a level of complexity that we can't maintain with low energy return on energy invested energy sources.
Well, I mean, that's on that front. Looking at the era of wind and solar now, I mean, I get all sorts of arguments. But my Patreon page has a lot of engineers on it, and I get one extreme. I have the very pro green technology, the other extreme I've got pro nuclear technology people, and they both make convincing arguments about the capacity of both those technologies to provide, because low density, of course, in the case of solar, but high efficiency. And then at the other end, high density and high efficiency from things like thorium nuclear reactors, which could be apparently a 40 megawatt thorium station could be the size of a small shipping container. The solar efficiency is reaching 50% now for the most advanced solar cells. So the potential is there to be able to have that energy. But again, if you take the energy off planet, if you're doing a reduction off planet mounting asteroids, then you don't have the limitations that we face on the biosphere. And I think, again, you and I both know what's going to happen to the sun in the next 4 billion years. At some point, the sun's orbit will be out to Mars.
Yes, exactly. When it becomes a red giant. But we won't have to worry about that personally.
I won't, of course, but if we don't think about it that way, there won't be humanity in the long distant future. And again, we have to consider what's. If I think of anything about our species, which is its redeeming feature, it's that we're the species that has some capacity to understand the universe. And if we don't fulfill that, then we're not fulfilling our own potential, our own nature. And staying on this planet for the endeavor, going the low tech forever, means that we will basically decide to become extinct, maybe 4 billion years away, which is a fair length of time. But so will all life on Earth. And if we truly value it, then at some stage we have to find a way to get life to be able to survive what we know is going to be happening at a solar system and galactic level. So you can call me a Trekkie if you like on that front. I don't think I'm not expecting to see anything about leaving the solar system in the next 10,000 years. But I would hope that in the next 10,000 years, we restore the Earth to something that is not as blemished as we've left it right now. And B, we develop the capacity to take a civilization off planet, possibly the Dyson sphere type concept. All those things should be within our capabilities over a 10,000 year period, which of course is more than the length of recorded human history. So, I'm doing a fair bit of extrapolation here. But I hope we can think that way, because that would then have me proud to be human. If I see instead that we drive ourselves extinct through global warming, or we fall back to deciding to become effectively cavemen again, then I think we've failed to be fully human.
I'd like to share the thoughts that you guys have generated in me, and then Steve, you said you only have about 10 minutes left.
I've got to get back to work, mate. Yes, so just one last bit of conversation. I better go.
Okay.
Nicole, we should have a few chats ourselves too. In a long time, to have had a good catch up.
Yes, definitely. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have 5 little bullet points. I'm going to try to put it into about 5 sentences, but it's probably going to be 10 sentences. I had a call earlier with 5 people, and we were talking about how to be more loving to everyone. Loving as in, like, showing them love, like hugs and kindness and whatnot. And that kind of dovetailed into the idea of nonviolent resistance, like Gandhi and MLK Jr. and Nelson Mandela, maybe. I don't know all the leaders in this area. But so my first question is there a likelihood that some sort of person like that, someone who is a nonviolent resistor, who's not willing to fight back, I mean, that they intentionally do not respond to violence, and that by it being obvious that we have a whole movement of people that are not responding to violence and they're being violated by the military or whoever, that changes the direction of things like it did those other times. And the other 2, I mean, this one is just kind of a shocker to me. It shocks me that we had this rocket launch with 2 white old guys going into outer space when we have people starving to death on the other side of the planet because they can't even get home and there's no food for them. And what kind of world are we in? What kind of global economy is this? And at the same time, I used Google Earth to zoom in on the Amazon last week, and it looks like the whole center portion of the Amazon's been eaten away, like chewed up, like it was somebody from outer space came and just chewed up all the trees and pulled them right out. So
sad.
But the rise of the possibility is in different places, like all sorts of places all over the place, is nonviolent resistance. So you don't respond to the violence and you just let them hit you, unfortunately, like Gandhi's followers did, like MLK's followers did. Is this something that might occur again? I mean, it seems like it's something that happens regularly throughout history.
I think it could, but I don't think it's predictable. I mean, it really depends on whether an individual comes along with the right kind of personality in the right place at the right time. So it really isn't something you can predict, unfortunately.
And whether it would be effective in the current circumstances, again, very hard to say. And non-violence to work involves a bit of restraint on the violent, on behalf of the violent. And that's what Gandhi exploited in India. the English couldn't be seen to kill him. There were certain, I believe there were assassination attempts at various times, but he used the fact that he could use public opinion against the perpetrators of violence by being non-violent. If you get to the stage of a complete fascist coup, which is what you got in Germany, at the time, the non-violence ultimately means you just get shot more easily. And you know, I hate to imagine the same sort of development in America, but the way the country is going right now, you know, I wouldn't rule it out that violence will be used against the non-violent, and it'll be then they'll become a footnote in history. They won't change history. So you know, it's something, again, you can't predict it. You can't say whether it's going to work or not. It might work, in which case I wouldn't try making any back history predictions as to why it had to work. It just, with that particular circumstance, it succeeded. Gandhi certainly did it in his own way. Nelson Mandela did as well, but that was also with the effective support of the ANC being a resistance movement against the Boers. So, you know, it's non-violence is I would never see anything as a panacea to our current situation, including non-violence.
One thing I would add is that during expansionary times, these sorts of movements get traction and they eventually work. So if you are living through expansionary times, you can push and push and push and expect to see some kind of achievement. So greater inclusiveness, a recognition of common humanity, and that's what you get on the way up when you're in that optimistic frame of mind. We're about to slide into a very pessimistic frame of mind where what's in the ascendance is going to be anger and fear. So it is much, much harder to try and get traction at any kind of large scale for nonviolent movements under circumstances like that. I think it can happen in the future at some point, but I think we have to wait for the negative impulse to run its course. I think as long as you've got the negative side of human nature in the ascendancy, you're not going to see movements like that get traction and actually really achieve something. But they absolutely will be able to achieve something when the contraction has run its course and we start to expand again, which we inevitably will. These things are cyclical. So the contraction is not going to last forever. We are going to start another form of expansion. And I think at that point, we're going to try and reclaim all the rights that we're going to lose over the next few years or next few decades.
Well, so I've got two more follow-ups. What if it was all the daughters that were out there? Like all the daughters were out there and the daughters were the ones who were protecting, for example, in the US, all the white daughters were protecting the people of color who were just, you know, trying to do their demo, you know, and have some speeches. What if it was all the daughters that like encircled them or something, and then in comes the police?
That did happen. Yesterday, there was at least one picture. I don't remember where, unfortunately, but that's exactly what happened. There was a row of black protesters, and in front of them, there was a row of white women with their arms out, holding hands to protect the protesters behind them. So yes, I mean, that will help, but I don't think it's going to change the system at large scale. It will protect the lives of some of the protesters in the short term, but I don't think it's necessarily going to change anything at large scale because we're very much still sliding into contraction. And this is only really the beginning of the psychology of contraction.
Here's another idea. What if on, say, Saturday, what's day Saturday? Saturday is the 6th of June. What if everybody, what if somebody said, hey, let's all just quit and walk off work at 12 noon GMT, and we're just gonna, or UTC, Universal Time, we're just gonna all quit, everybody on the whole planet, and we're not gonna work anymore. We're not gonna be cops, we're just gonna take a break. We're gonna take a break until things are better, like a week or 2 weeks or whatever it takes. And it doesn't matter if you're a police officer. It doesn't matter if you're, you know, a politician. It doesn't matter if you're a grocery store worker. That everybody just quit all at the same time, all at once.
I do think you'll have general strikes in some places. I'm not so sure that's going to happen in the States, though. I mean, in the States, you get very little paid holiday. You get probably no paid sick leave, or at least very, very little. People live paycheck to paycheck. They don't have the option to not work because the system is so overstretched that they just don't have money sitting in the bank, and they can't just say, I'm going to quit my job. Even if they absolutely hate their job, they're not necessarily in a position to quit and sit at home because they don't have any money. And if you don't have any money, you're not going to have any food, and your heating is going to get cut off, or your air conditioning, and eventually you won't be able to pay your rates, and your property will be taken away from you, and things like that. So people say, well, why don't Americans demonstrate like the French? Well, they can't, because there isn't the safety net that there is in France, in the States. And France isn't the only one that has a safety net. But the French are known for being demonstrators par excellence, shall we say. They just demonstrate like almost nobody else on the face of the earth. But they do have a safety net that allows them to do that without starving to death in the meantime. I can't see it happening in the States in the same way.
How about an amendment where the actual essential workers that keep the grid up and keep the food coming, they agree to keep working. We agree to keep feeding them. We continue doing food distributions like we're already doing in my county. We go get the food from the Michigan farms, we take it to where the people pick it up, and then everybody else just quit. So the food still goes to everybody.
That involves a level of political organization which simply doesn't exist in the States in any sense whatever. It's a nice utopian dream, but it's a completely utopian proposal. I wish there was some possibility of that happening, but you just simply don't have the society which would give any level of support to that whatsoever. So, you know, these are lovely what ifs, but I'm afraid they're simply not going to happen. I've got to get back to work, so I better really leave both. So good to talk. I've got to get back to my papers.
Thank you, Steve.
Well,
Okay.
nice to see you again.
Bye, Matt.
So do you have more time for me?
Yeah, I do. My appointment isn't just yet. I probably have, I don't know, another hour.
Okay.
Thereabouts. But I'm not 100% sure because my dentist is not in the same town that I'm in, and I'm not sure what the traffic is going to be like at the point where I have to drive over there. So I do have to leave some margin for error in there.
I feel frustrated because it almost seems like if something like those hypotheticals I pointed out, if something like that, I don't know if it would be one of those or something different, but if that doesn't happen, then I mean, it almost sounds like we're going to have people starving to death, and we're going to have people killed in violent protests and riots. And I think the word that was used today in the US was we need to stop calling them riots and we need to call them revolutions.
Well, I do think that you're going to see a revolution eventually, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be something that happens and succeeds yet. I mean, what I think you're looking at is civil war, balkanization and civil war. So the United States dividing up into cultural regions.
Along what fault lines? I mean, civil war into two factions?
Cultural fault lines. Fault lines.
What is the cultural fault line in the US?
Oh, there are several of them. There's a brilliant book called The 9 Nations of North America. So that was written in the 80s. And there's another one, someone else has taken the same idea and written about it more recently, and he's come up with 11 cultural regions. But it's things like Cascadia, for instance. So people on the coast of British Columbia have a whole lot in common with people in Seattle and Portland, a lot more than they do with people in the Midwest or Quebec or Florida and things like that. So you have Cascadia, you have I'm thinking in terms of Joel Garreau's 9 Nations of North America now, if I can remember them all. Cascadia was the West Coast. Then there was the South Florida and the islands. There's the Foundry, which is the whole area around the Great Lakes where all the industrial stuff originally was. Quebec is a separate one. New England is a separate one, but I can't remember specifically what he called New England. He did have a specific name for it. The empty quarter was the area in the middle that's like Alberta, and then all the way down to, you know, Colorado and places. The places on the east side of the mountains that are dry.
Empty as
and
in empty as in no one would live there?
Not very many people live there. Low population density and things. So there's not high population density in the areas around the Great Plains, for instance. There are people there, but it's not densely populated like, say, New York City. So that's more what he's looking at, that there's this very low population density area where there's a lot of resources. So that's one of his regions. Then there was Dixie and the breadbasket. I think that might be all of them. I can't quite remember, but yeah, he analyzed all these different regions, looking at the cultures that had developed in these places, and to some extent it was a question of geography. To some extent it was national culture from where the majority population came from in any given area. Sometimes it's a combination of various factors, but yeah, there are very different cultures in the United States. And I think division along cultural fault lines is extremely likely at some point. I think it's very likely in Canada too, because Canada has cultural fault lines. The West is not the same as the East, the Maritimes, at all culturally. And I think things do break down. We're going to see the same thing in Europe. I think the European Union is going to break down. You get political accretion during expansionary times, so things grow. Political entities expand. They take on new members. They're empires, basically. So they're empires in the expansion phase. But then when the pie is shrinking and there's not enough to go around, then they start to break up again, because the people in them don't see themselves as sufficiently similar to be part of the same political entity. When trust breaks down, what you get is people starting to look for differences instead of similarities. They lose sight of the common humanity, and they start to look for all kinds of factors that can be used to distinguish between, you know, us and them, so to speak. I mean, it could be skin colors, the obvious one. It could be eye color. It could be hair texture. It could be accent. It could be manner of speaking. It could be personality. There's so many different ways that people can distinguish. And once you start to put an us versus them value judgment on that distinction, that's when you start to get into trouble. When you get into a situation where people don't see themselves as part of a common species anymore. They see their own group, their own tribe as being the good guys, and the other tribes as all being the bad guys. So you can get very close-knit relationships within a tribe, but that tribe might completely hate the other tribes around them. And you get these kinds of dynamics. So much smaller scale, the actions of individuals end up mattering more at smaller scale, because it's like they end up being a large cog in a small machine. I think so. It's going to depend a lot on who comes along and what they decide to do in any given place. We're definitely going to be looking at smaller scale, and we're going to be looking at the failure of the larger scale entities. They just are not going to be able to function in an environment where there's no trust.
I apologize, but I skipped dinner.
No problem.
Okay, so this goes back to what people can do and will be doing and already are doing. For example, for the first time in my life, I planted potatoes yesterday. Mm-hmm. We had a box of potatoes. I don't know, some sort of potato that's an heirloom kind, and all I did is I put these potatoes down on the ground in the garden. Mm-hmm. I didn't even till it up. Every 6 inches, put one of these down, and then I went and got the wheelbarrow, got some dirt, brought it over, put a pile of dirt on each potato, and then I covered it up with this hay. Mm-hmm. And then my wife said, well, I said, well, don't you normally grow a couple other things at the same time to prevent like pests and things? And she said, well, yeah, here's the she says, here's what you do. You take these peas and you put the peas every other, you put your finger in every like 2 inches and you put a pea in and the peas will grow, but you don't put them right on top of the potatoes, but close to the potatoes. And then with the onions, there's little onion bulbs. Put those on like the other side, and then you can grow them all kind of on top of it. I mean, they're not on top of each other, but they'll all grow in the same soil. I mean, is this crazy that I'm doing this?
Oh, not at all. In fact, look into the Three Sisters. That was the planting technique used by the Native Americans. So it was corn and beans and squash. So the idea was you grow the corn, and then the beans will use the corn stalks to climb up, and then the squash will spread out and cover the ground so that it keeps the weeds down. It's called the Three Sisters. Companion planting.
Well, and I know corn grows well in Michigan, and I know that potatoes also.
I have grown Three Sisters before. What I find is that the corn is not necessarily strong enough to hold up the beans. So I found that I had to put in stakes as well, because otherwise the beans kind of attacked the corn and sort of dragged it down to its doom. So it was a bit like, a sea monster coming out from the sea and sort of grabbing it and dragging it down. And
there's
so
a guy
sort of what happened with the corn.
There's a guy in Australia, I don't remember his name, but he has a channel. He has like 500,000 subscribers or something like that, a lot. And all he does, he's like, I don't know, he's called like the learning permaculturist or something. And so he explained that too with the corn, and he said the soil can't be too rich, because if the soil is too rich, then the corn will grow too fast and it'll be too thin. And so he said, don't amend the soil until after it's tall.
Yeah, you don't need to, because the beans produce nitrogen. The beans fix nitrogen with their roots, and that feeds the corn and the squash. So you don't need to enrich the soil. That's part of the idea of the companion planting, that each thing provides a service to the other plants around it, so that together they grow better than they would individually. So growing legumes in general will fix nitrogen in your soil. There's some trees that do it too. So if you have an area where you want to enrich the soil with some nitrogen, there are things you can grow that will do that.
How urgent is this? I mean, how urgent is it that a viewer here goes out and plants a garden in June of 2020? I mean, I think
it's a really helpful thing, because if you have some kind of food sovereignty, even if it's only a little bit, it's better than none at all, because we're going to have problems down the line with food supply chains, especially in the States, because the distances are large and farmers can't afford to pay anyone to harvest their food. I mean, they can't necessarily bring in the people they would normally bring in because of the virus. They don't have a lot of money, because they've been completely screwed over by this administration for the last 3 years. I mean, farmers have been going out of business before the virus, en masse, because their markets were disappearing because of Trump's trade wars. So he was having these bailout plans for farmers, but it was all the bigger players that were getting the bailout money. So what you had in farming in the States is a forced scaling up over the last 3 years. So you have a trade war, the farmers lose their markets, you have compensation programs, but all the money ends up going to the big players. The little players go out of business, their land is taken over by the bigger players. So you've got a forced scaling up, and only the larger players can compete in that environment. But when you've got a very large farm that could be a very long way from the nearest city, because the distances are huge, you can't sell what you're producing, because now the restaurants and people that you were producing it for don't want anything anymore. You've just lost your customers, and it's a long way to go anywhere. if you don't have the money to harvest the food, you just plow it under. That's what farmers are doing. Now, there are places where where the farm is close enough that people can go and pick the stuff themselves and find other ways to market it. But there's a lot of food being wasted. There are a lot of animals being euthanized. There are a lot of plants being just plowed under. And all of that was food that people were eating that's not going to be available. So it's about 50% of the food supply was going into the commercial stream rather than retail. And pretty much all of that just dropped off a cliff. So there are shortages in retail at the same time as other things are being completely wasted just because you can't connect the two. You can't get the food from where it is to where it needs to be. And the people who are hungry don't necessarily have money, and the farmer isn't going to give them food without money. So you have a huge amount of problems. And I think this is going to feed through into major food supply problems in the fall. So not that far off. I think the United States is going to start to see major problems with food supply. And yes, I do think there are going to be people who starve. I think it's inevitable. And it's horrible to think that in one of the richest countries in the world that something like that would happen. But I don't really see any way to avoid it. The problem is that the changes with the virus happened so quickly, there was no opportunity to adapt in the meantime. People didn't have time to set up new ways of marketing things or new ways of getting harvest picked and sent somewhere that somebody would want it. Everything just happened quickly. It was just all of a sudden, everything is now shut and no opportunity to work out how they were going to go from here. And there are going to be consequences for that inevitably. Here, I think that because the distances are a lot smaller, you're going to have less of an issue with that. If there's a lot of unemployment, they will find people in this country who will go and pick fruit and things because they will need some money. But in the States, I think it's going to be much, much harder.
So for security, my conception of security is keeping your neighbors close and your more distant neighbors even closer. Because I mean, I've got two groups of people, right? I've got the people I see in real life on a daily or weekly basis, and those are my actual neighbors. And then I have the people that I interact with on the internet, which I interact with, you know, a lot. I mean, almost daily, if not hourly. It makes sense to try to build those networks, doesn't it? Like I've been adding people that I recognize on Facebook into my Facebook feed, and I've been messaging with more people. Like I'm messaging with people I never talked to before. I mean, they went to the same school as me, but I never really talked to them before. And I've been writing these pieces, and people have been responding to them. So I've been trying to, you know, keep the conversation going by talking with them.
I've been trying to do that on Facebook as well, because that just is where the largest number of people I connect with happen to hang out at the moment. So at some point, it's going to be more difficult because I think Facebook is engaging in a lot more censorship and it's becoming more problematic in general. So eventually people probably need a different platform, but I don't know which one will emerge as being the one that people gravitate to at this point. I've heard things about MeWe. I have an account there. I've never actually used it, but that would probably be where I would look if I couldn't use Facebook. I spend a lot of time on Twitter too.
I think somebody else mentioned WeWe. I am concerned that, I mean, Facebook could just delete an account and they're like, you know, that person's whatever. Or somebody says, hey, he's a whatever, put him on the list, and delete his account or her account. And the same thing with YouTube. I mean, if anybody's viewing this, the first place it went was YouTube. So if it's on YouTube, great. But if it's somewhere else and YouTube's not available, then I mean, if you're finding this on torrent, then it's not on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet, then you know something went wrong.
Yep, I think they're going to censor a lot more than they have done. I mean, this happened during the Arab Spring as well. The countries that were affected were censoring the internet, were just basically shutting down social media. And I think other countries were offering Egyptians and Tunisians access to the internet through their countries. Places like France, I think, were doing that. So at that point, it wasn't very successful shutting down the internet. I don't know how successful it'll be going forward, but more successful than that, I think. I think it's very, very likely, especially in the States, that the Trump administration are going to shut down a whole lot of things that they find inconvenient. I mean, we saw just this past week, for the first time, Twitter timidly fact-checked Trump twice, in the most timid way possible. Just put a little link underneath saying, for more information on postal votes, go here. Because Trump had said that, if you have a postal vote election, it'll be massively fraudulent. And so Twitter was trying to say that, no, it wouldn't be, it will be absolutely fine. But they didn't take his tweet down or anything like that. They just put a link to more information underneath.
What would happen if they froze his account or deleted his account?
Well, personally, I think they should. But it would be very difficult for them to do that. I think there would be tremendous...
How many Twitter users would have to quit Twitter in order for them to and say, I'm quitting until his account's gone? How many people would it take? 10%? 50%?
Oh, it's impossible to know. I mean, a huge percentage of his followers aren't real people anyway. They're bots. So it's impossible to know. There's so many bots on Twitter. You don't know how many people there are real people in the first place. But yeah, they should absolutely ban his account. So he got fact-checked twice for the first time ever. And the next day, he was putting out an executive order trying to completely rewrite the law on social media to make social media platforms liable for things that their users post, which would just mean that would be opening up social media to being sued right, left, and center. And he's just trying to interfere with their business, trying to use whatever leverage he can to try and force them to allow him to lie to people with impunity. And that seems to be what Twitter's deciding not to let him do. I mean, they really need to be far more forceful about that. They should ban his account. If they're not going to do that, they should relentlessly fact check him. The other thing they did recently after he signed the executive order was they actually put a box over one of his tweets and said, this contravenes our terms of service because it glorifies violence. So they didn't take the tweet down, but you had to click through that box in order to see it. So they are finally calling him on his copious violations of their terms of service. And rightly so. I mean, Facebook should do the same thing, and they're not. Facebook has decided they're perfectly happy to accept money to allow politicians to lie to people. And I think that's completely unacceptable, but it's very profitable, obviously. So this is what Facebook is going along with. And Twitter is just deciding not to go along with that. But we'll have to wait and see how far it goes, because I'm sure he does have quite a lot of pressure that he can apply to private companies. And he has absolutely no qualms about interfering in private enterprise or interfering in other states, in other cities. He will basically say reality is whatever he says it is, and the law is whatever he says it is, and he will simply order them to do what he wants them to do. And they can try and refuse, and then there'll be a conflict, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I think there will be lots of conflicts between the administration and social media going forward, especially if people start using social media to organize more protests, which is something that I think is extremely likely to happen.
Well, if you're thinking, there's a thought that came up. I was talking with one of my neighbors yesterday, and he was explaining that he thought the grocery store in our town, the shelves look much more sparsely stocked than they did a month or two ago. And I haven't been in there, so.
I haven't noticed that in the shops here, But I have seen pictures of other places that did seem to have somewhat thinly stocked shelves. I can't remember specifically where, but I think some of them were in the States.
Is it possible that certain, like, food processing and packaging companies are just shutting down certain products? Like, we're not going to make these 10 products, and
Well, a big part of the problem is to do with packaging, but it's to do with the fact that now everything has to go through retail, and there isn't enough retail type packaging for these things. So if a restaurant is buying eggs, it's not buying them in little boxes of 12 like you would find in the grocery store. They're buying enormous flats of these things. So when you suddenly kill off all the wholesale and commercial stuff and try and move everything into the retail supply chain, you don't have the packaging for it. So I think these packaging companies are probably running flat out, but they can't keep up. So you're finding you can't put the products on the shelves because you don't have access to the packaging for them in the way that you would have to package them to put them on a grocery store shelf.
so it's not necessarily that there's actually a shortage yet of fruits and vegetables and
Not yet,
legumes
but I
and
think there will
nuts.
be.
But there's a secondary, there's two issues, right? One is that there's the amount of food being grown is apparently declining, or it's being destroyed.
Yeah,
on
it's
purpose.
being thought under. Yeah.
That's a travesty.
Yes.
I mean,
It's
because
horrendous, but farmers are soul destroyed about having to do this. It's not that they want to, but if they can't afford to harvest it and they have no market for it, they don't see themselves as having any other choice.
why don't they
And it's
just leave
really
it there? Why don't they just leave it there and tell people they can come and get it? I mean, why drive a tractor over it? That takes energy. I mean, what's the point? Why not just leave it there?
Well, maybe some of them are, but I guess some of them are plowing it in to use as basically green manure for the next season.
But that would have been eaten by somebody. I mean, the previous season, that same crop was sold to someone, and it was eaten by someone somewhere.
If there are enough people near the farm that can actually get there and pick stuff and say, have some for their family, take some to food banks, I should think farmers would be fine with that. But some of these farms are pretty remote. And if you had to have people drive in from all over the place, and every vehicle is using gas to do that, then you end up with an awful lot of fossil fuels being used to go and get that food, because you're having umpteen little cars rather than a few delivery trucks.
Well, what if we got a hold? What if somebody that has a semi, because in the United States, people actually own a tractor trailer, and some of them own the trailer and the tractor. What if we said, hey, we're going to get a van, and we're going to go down, and we're going to follow you to wherever the farm is, and we're going to get out, and we're going to go pick all this stuff and put it in the tractor trailer, and we're going to bring it back to the city or wherever.
I want to introduce you to some friends of mine in Australia. Kirsten Larson and Serenity Hill. They run something called the Open Food Network out of Melbourne. And it does pretty much what you just described, but they've been doing it for a long time. It's not just a response to the virus. What they've been trying to do, Kirsten Larson and Serenity Hill. So I can introduce them to you. They're awesome people. They really are absolutely lovely. And what they've been doing is trying to arrange transportation and distribution for the products from small growers. So often it's difficult for small growers to be able to distribute their stuff because they don't necessarily have a vehicle, or they don't need that much space for just their little bit, but they need a bigger vehicle needs to be full, and they can't fill it by themselves. So what this Open Food Network does is it coordinates these smaller players and the people who have the distribution network capacity in order to get food from where it's produced to where it needs to be in the most efficient way possible. So it's giving the smaller growers a leg up, which is great. I mean, you definitely want to rescue what the larger farmers are producing, but at the same time, if you can also help the smaller producers to distribute goods around, even if only within town, then you will have a less chance that people will starve. I mean, it's a question of getting the food to the people who are hungry. And that's what this program is about. So it's called the Open Food Network in Melbourne.
Open Food Network in Melbourne. Is there a possibility of, like, when people start seeing, I mean, at a certain point, when the shelves get to a certain point, somebody's going to panic, right? And they're going to go get, they're going to just start, they're going to be in the store. They're actually going to be physically in the store, and they're going to be like, oh my gosh. And they're going to start loading their cart, and they're going to use their credit card and just fill up their cart. And somebody else is going to see that, and they're going to fill up their cart. And in quick order, the store's just going to be empty. And then,
absolutely.
Then in the media, they'll say, hey, you know, such and such a store emptied today in panic buying of food. Then that's going to be on the news. Just
panic buying increases demand. And demand increases enormously in the very short term. So the supply chain has no opportunity to adapt. That's exactly the problem. That's why people couldn't find toilet paper, because there was this perception that there was going to be a toilet paper shortage. And when you have that perception, it becomes reality because people respond to it in a way that creates a reality. And that will absolutely happen for other things too. It's just a question of when. So what I would say to people is, by all means, stock up right now. So plant things now if you can, but also stock up on non-perishable foods. If you have anywhere that you can store these things, stock up on them and hang on to them for next winter. You'll probably be okay this summer, but next winter there could be problems. And you're not hoarding if you just planned in advance and purchased what you needed at a time when there was no shortage. So it's not like you were taking something that somebody else would have been panic buying or anything. It's not panicking if you do it early enough. You're just preparing. And then at the point where other people are panicking, then you don't have to be one of the people in the store making it worse because you prepared already. And that's what people need to do, I think. They need to make sure that they have the capacity to feed themselves, if at all possible, for a few months without having to go to the store, or at least maybe only having to go very occasionally for a small range of things that you can't really store. So for us, that would be milk. So we do have powdered milk, and we use powdered milk for weeks, but fresh milk is nicer. So we tend to go to the store and buy milk. But we haven't been buying anywhere near the amount of food that we used to buy before, because we've been working through our supplies that we put in for preparation. And there's been no problem with that. I mean, we literally were ready to go for months without ever having to go to the store. And we still could have gone for longer without going to the store. We didn't have to go even now, but we did, because now the stores have opened up and things. So there was no reason to not be able to have fresh milk instead of powdered. So we went. I don't think there are going to be huge problems with food chains here, but nevertheless, I do intend to keep a supply of frozen food and dried food, far more than I was in the habit of keeping before the virus. I think I will end up keeping a supply for probably the next several years, because I think there's going to be a lot of upheaval in that time, and you just never know when you might need it. So yes, growing a garden, putting in the productive capacity yourself, but if you can't do that, at least storing whatever you can, stuff that's going to last, that is going to mean that you're not going to be panicking along with everybody else at some point if there isn't enough in the stores.
Now, are we talking about, now obviously if somebody does this though, and they live in a neighborhood, it's going to come, I mean, if this, you know, let's call this a 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring. So if this 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring thing, where the shelves are empty in the winter, in the stores, the grocery stores, and you can't buy food because there's no food, Amazon, whatever, you know, your neighbors are going to notice that you're not losing weight.
Yeah, you might want to just eat a bit less and lose some weight so it's not obvious. Yes, that's true. And you don't want to paint your house either, and you don't want to be driving a new car and wearing flash clothes and things like that. You know, if you are better off, don't make it look like you are.
So the other opportunity, the other options, just to kind of think of it as you're buying for the community, even though it's really you that's paying for the food.
You can absolutely be thinking of it as buying for the community. People who have the capacity to store more, if they have more resources, I mean, more money to buy food in the first place and more space to store it, it would be a wonderful thing if people who are in a position to do that would store some for people besides just their own family. Because if there are community stores, that would be a wonderful thing. If you can build a community root cellar, because I mean, you have a nice sort of round street, there would be room there that you could build a root cellar that would serve the houses on your street, for instance. That wouldn't be too difficult, I wouldn't think. And that would allow people to preserve food that they're growing. I mean, you have big gardens and things as well. There's lots of space. People could grow a lot of food on your street. And if there was somewhere to store it so that
Well,
people could...
my street's not necessarily that much different from the suburbs in most of the US, that the houses are fairly well spaced. I mean, each house is on,
Yes,
maybe, it might be a quarter of an acre, but that's still, I mean, that's bigger than the footprint of the house.
Yes. Yeah, so whatever land people have that they can grow food on, if they can then store it in a way that people can and access it communally, then I think that would be great. I mean, you would probably want an inventory, and you would want a lock on the door, and then you would perhaps want somebody nominated to be the root cellar keeper. And so people say, you know, I would like X number of pounds of bell peppers, please, or something on the weekend, and then you just go and you pick it up. And
I could imagine something like, you know, an eco village where basically the community prepares a meal for the entire community, and then everybody comes and dines together, and then whatever's left is kept for tomorrow. And so it's not even come and get, it's just that this is what we're going to make the food out of, and we're going to protect it because, you know, we're going to have some breakfast and we're going to have some lunch.
You might want to invest in some communal freezer capacity as well as root cellars, because if you have extra freezer space, then you can store a ton of food in a way that will keep for half of forever, really. And that way you're not going to run out.
Well,
so you want storage capacity.
You need electricity, though.
So root cellars are great because a root cellar doesn't require electricity. A freezer does. But if you're going to have some electricity, and you could also invest in communal power generation to power a communal freezer space, fridge and freezer space, things like that, you can definitely do things like this. And then you've got the storage capacity that allows you to have that cushion so that you don't end up in panic mode because you've got some to fall back on. And that's really, really important. You have to have some stocks. You have to have that redundancy, some supplies that give you resilience. And you could absolutely do that where you live. A communal greenhouse would be great too. So if you can, and there's enough land somewhere that you could put in a communal greenhouse, perhaps do one of these double-skinned ones where you can grow stuff all year round. Anything that's tolerant of short day length, anyway, you can still grow in a greenhouse in winter, even in Michigan, if you have an insulated greenhouse. And the way to do that is with these double-skinned greenhouses that you blow soap bubbles in between the two layers, because that's transparent. So the light gets in, but the heat doesn't get out. And so you can put a little heater in the greenhouse and the heat will stay in the greenhouse. So then you can massively extend your growing season. And that could be really, really useful. So then you've got communal food production, communal food storage requiring electricity, communal food storage not requiring electricity. And you would find that for something like your street, you really would be able to supply a lot of people's food.
I mean, obviously I'm concerned about my street because, you know, I want to make sure my children and my neighbors and my neighbors' neighbors and my neighbors' neighbors' neighbors are all set, you know, because I'm friends with all my neighbors and I know they're friends with the next neighbors and they're friends with the next neighbors. So it's a big network, right? Except
Yep.
there are some people that are kind of introverts that kind of don't really participate. And I'm concerned that, you know, I mean, we're going to have to reach out to them the sooner the better.
Yes.
To make friends.
Definitely.
And
the other thing is, I mean, you guys are vegan, but I don't know how many of your neighbors would be. So it's worth talking to them about how they might plan for the things that they eat, because you'll be sorting out the things that you eat, but I think it would be a pretty darn good idea if people had some chickens and say maybe some bunnies or something, and that wouldn't have to be your thing because you're vegan, but for other people, I think, I mean, chickens are absolutely awesome. They can be so useful, and you don't have to eat the chickens, you know, but chickens produce eggs, and they will make eggs out of all kinds of unbelievable stuff that a human would never put in their mouth. So it just gives people something to fall back on that's a source of fats and proteins in a way that doesn't harm the animal at all. I mean, for instance, at the farm, we had free-range chickens. They were hedge-dwelling chickens. They used to go just run around, hide under the hedge, and run around all over the place. They never went out into the road. There were about 20 of them, and they just wandered around, ate the bugs out of the sheep poop and various other things, dug around, ate worms and all sorts, and produced eggs for us. And that was a wonderful thing, because we eat a lot of eggs. And I imagine there would be people in your neighborhood who would be interested in something like that. So it's really important to think of how you get your macronutrients. So how you plan for proteins and fats. And you can obviously eat carbohydrates as well, but you don't really have to plan as much for those because they're not essential. So you can have as many of them as you want, but they're not something you have to plan for to the same extent as you have to plan for things that you actually require. So there are a number of things people require. Proteins and fats, definitely. Omega-3, omega-6, omega-9 are essential fatty acids, for instance. Various places, plant and animal sources that you can get things like that from. Hazelnuts are great to grow as well if you want a plant source for proteins and fats. Hazelnuts will give you fruit in about 3 years, so you don't even have to wait all that long. And they're not enormous. They're more bushy than trees.
Does it make sense for people to be buying like fruit trees and nut trees and just like,
yes,
if there's a vacant lot,
yes,
just planting them in the vacant lot?
Yep, absolutely. And if you can get ones that are partway grown, that would be better. If you just plant tiny seedlings, you're not going to see anything for about 15 years. But with hazelnuts, you'll get something in 3 years. And with other things, you can buy a tree that's 10 years old. So it costs more money, but you can buy a tree that's partway there where you're going to get a crop pretty quickly.
So
that's another thing you can do communally. You can get the community together to invest in a certain number of fruit and nut trees.
Does it make
Woody
sense?
agriculture gives you sovereignty, food sovereignty.
Does it make sense if, so if you've got, say, $100 to spend on hazelnut trees, ought you spend the $100 on a single tree that's much larger, or like $50 for 2 trees that are smaller?
Well, with hazelnuts, I don't think you need to worry about it because they tend to be more bushes anyway. So, and they don't take a long time to produce a crop. They're not like great big trees that take ages. So that would be a good one to go with. Hickories and chestnuts and things too. Chestnuts are carbohydrates, but they're delicious. Chestnuts are so good. And my friend Phil Rutter, who runs the American Chestnut Association, has been breeding for disease-free chestnuts. Because there was a problem with diseases in chestnut trees that got rid of a whole lot of them. But he's been breeding for disease resistance and things. He makes chestnut polenta, which I think you would find absolutely delicious. I mean, it's a good way of using chestnuts to make a whole lot of other different kinds of food. You could probably make bread out of chestnuts, for instance. I mean, I make something that's vaguely bread-like out of almond meal, for instance, or I can make muffins out of almond meal, and then it's something I can actually eat. I try not to eat them too often because they still make me bloat a bit. They're still a bit high carb for me, but at least it's something I can get away with from time to time. And there are all sorts of things that you can do along those lines.
Does it make sense to like go to the Seed Savers place? Like in the States, we have this thing called Seed Savers Exchange, and it's just a bunch of people. Yeah, but it's actually individuals though. And the individuals will have seeds that they'll save at the end of the season, and they'll package them up and everything. And then you can, this isn't the only one. There's like a lot of them. Like on Facebook, you just go to Seed Savers or Seed Sharers or whatever. And would it make sense to just like get a shelf in the house and just like designate that as next season's planting seeds?
Yes, because that's another thing that there will be shortages of. People are finding already that it's hard to get seeds. It's hard to get seedlings because everybody tried to plant a garden thinking that there might not be enough food. And so there was a shortage of that too. So absolutely, I would get hold of the seeds for next year at whatever point you can, because they might not be there next year. And if you can get things where you're going to be able to save seed so you don't have to buy it again, so much the better. So things where you grow it this coming year, and then you save the seed, and then you use that to grow your crop the next year. Mind you, most of the commercial seeds are F1 hybrids, so they don't breed true. But if you can get heirlooms that do breed true, then there's no reason you can't save seed and do that yourself year after year.
This reminds me a lot of like, well, in the US, they used to have what's called a Grange Hall, like in the Michigan, and the Grange Hall was somewhere like in the county, somewhere in the area, like in a township, and people would like get together at the Grange Hall and they'd have parties and things. But it was like for like in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was like for the farm, the people that are growing foods and stuff. So it sounds like there'd be an opportunity for still to have some good times, like in the evenings with the neighbors, you know, and you get together and you play music and you tell jokes and the kids play.
Roast marshmallows around a fire, by all means. Things like that are wonderful. They bring people together like nothing else. And when you've got people together and you all know each other, then you're prepared to work together. And that's incredibly important. And I think the size of your little area is just about perfect for a number of people to work together to be able to put in communal infrastructure, whether it's energy or food storage or gardens or hoop houses, whatever it might be.
Yeah, but I'm sure there may be like one or two of my neighbors that watch this, which is great. I mean, thanks for watching, guys. But most of the people that are likely to watch this are not here close to me. They're probably, let's say they're in Iowa or Arizona or the Dakotas or in Cascadia.
One of the things that occurred to me to ask is, are you guys on well and septic?
Yes.
Okay, because it's going to make a difference with people who are and people who aren't. Communities that are on well and septic, I would suggest to invest in some communal hand pumps for wells. Because if you have a power blackout, then that could be extremely important. So if you know Sharon Astick, she has a neighbor, or from where she used to live, near Albany, she has a neighbor who makes them, who makes kits for hand pumps for wells. I think they were about $400, which is not unreasonable.
Our water is deep though. It's like 60 feet down in the well.
Yeah, and it won't be easy. So ours was 140 feet down at the farm. It can be done. It's not necessarily simple, but if it's a question of do we want water or do we not, then you probably do your best to get water that way if you possibly can. But if it's communal, then everybody can take turns. It's not like one person has to do it all for themselves. So it's not like every single well would need a pump. Maybe you can have a communal well that has a hand pump, or something, so that if there's a problem with power, then instead of everybody using their own well, then everyone has the communal access to the communal well, and everyone can be doing their pumping. And if you don't want to pump because maybe you're like 90 years old and frail or something, then you can trade something with a younger person so that they will pump your water for you. So this again builds relationships. It's sort of, what do you have that you can offer someone else? If you want them to do the physical work of providing your water, then maybe you can give them something. And I think there are all sorts of possibilities for barter at that scale. But if you're on town water, it's different. If you're on town water, then there could be problems with town water, as there have been in various parts of the world. Things don't necessarily work out so well in contractionary times. Complex things don't necessarily work out, so you can end up with your water supply contaminated. So this happened in Camelford in Cornwall in England, and also in somewhere beginning with W in Ontario.
And Flint, Michigan.
Flint, Michigan has terrible water as well, absolutely. So you can't necessarily assume that your town water is going to be drinkable. So it really helps as well to have rainwater barrels set up, to have rainwater catchment on roof surfaces, your house, your garage, if it's a separate building, and things like that. And then you can have great big rainwater tanks under your garden, and things like that can be really useful too. Because water's something you absolutely cannot afford to run out of.
Sorry, the cat said you need to go up to the bathroom, outside the bathroom.
Yep, no problem. We have 4 of those. We know what they're like.
My son, he's like, Dad, I figured out when the cat wants to go out, he'll do this like super excited thing. Because even though we have a litter box here, he doesn't like it. I mean, he'd prefer to go outside. So, yeah. And he just showed up one summer, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 summers ago, just showed up. We didn't feed him or anything. We didn't give him water. We didn't feed him because we didn't know where he came from. And he just never left. I mean, he's just like, nope. You belong to me now. This is where I live. and we didn't let him in the house until this past December. And so he's been like living in the garage, and I mean, he doesn't spend a lot of time, but when it's cold, because in Michigan, it gets down in the winter, it can get down to, in Fahrenheit, it can get down to -10. So in Celsius, that would be about -25.
Yeah, the coldest I remember from Ottawa was -40, which is the same in Celsius and Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this
it
is
was
not
pretty cold.
I mean, that's one of the current concerns I also have for Michigan. I mean, if this 1/10% thing happens, I'm concerned about freezing, especially because people that are on well water, those pipes will freeze and they'll burst, and then the whole pipe system is ruined, the pressurized system.
Yeah, you have to insulate your pipes. And we had problems like that in one year. I remember in Ottawa when I was growing up. Normally, when it's really cold, like we also have tons of snow and things. Ottawa is a very snowy place normally. But this particular winter when I was young, I might have been about 10 or something like that. It was -40 almost all winter, and there was very little snow. And people's wells and septic systems froze up, and it was terrible. I mean, once your septic system is frozen, you're not using it again until spring. There isn't really any way to open it up again.
The septic system froze?
Yeah, the pipes from the toilet out to the septic tank. So people were finding they couldn't use. Yeah, it was terrible. They couldn't use the toilets, the sinks, the showers, the washing machines and things. And I mean, I was young enough that I wasn't affected at all, and I wasn't as aware of the things that were happening to people as I would have been if I'd been older. But still, it was a problem, and it could be a problem again for various other people.
So would it make sense then to, like, again, this is like scenario planning. Like, I mean, I have I have insurance on this. We have insurance on this house, fire insurance, flood
Mhm.
insurance, tornado insurance. We have those insurances on this, theft insurance. We have all these insurances on the house. I don't know how much we pay, $100 a month or whatever.
Mhm.
I don't ever expect that to ever happen, but I know it can happen because I've seen other houses burn down, and I didn't expect them to burn down either.
Don't count on insurance, by the way.
What's that?
Insurance companies are overstretched, and they're not going to be able to pay out if there are a lot of claims all at once. So insurance is going to be a short-term thing. If something happens, if your house burns down this year, you'll get a payout. If it burns down in 10 years' time, probably not. So be a bit careful about insurance, because they'll perfectly happily take your money, but they won't necessarily pay out, depending on what situation the company is in themselves at the point where you make a claim.
Well, more what I was thinking of was that, you know, there's certain things that insurance doesn't cover. Like they don't cover that the grocery stores are empty.
Yep.
And they don't cover that there's no electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't cover that your house doesn't have heat.
Yep, this is true.
Because the electricity's off or the propane tank's empty, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
there are going to be a whole lot of risks that people are going to have to manage themselves that they haven't had to worry about so much for a long time. And I think that's going to be one of the major aspects of people adapting, is having to think, what risks do I face and how can I manage them? Because people haven't really had to worry about that for quite a long time. It's just, oh, well, if this happens, you call this emergency service, or you make an insurance claim for that, and you don't really worry about it so much. But when you don't have some of those things to fall back on, it's much more of an issue again. People are going to have a lot more personal responsibility for risk management than they've had for a long time. And that's going to be a really steep learning curve. So trying to climb that now, before those risks realize, that's super, super important.
If there are people that are like growing food as if, I mean, it kind of looks like they're doing it like their lives depend upon it. I mean, I've heard of people that are just like out there. I haven't heard of them, but I can imagine someone hearing some information like this and being like, oh, well, I guess I know what I'm going to do 10 hours a day for the rest of the summer, which is going to be change this whole landscape into food growing. Is that crazy?
It would be a good idea. It would really be a good idea if people did that. As if you want to live out of a garden, you have to live in it. So it is a fair amount of work. If what you're growing is annuals, if you are actually planting a food forest and doing a permaculture design, then all the work is at the front, where you're laying everything out, you're thinking how to organize everything, and you're planting your stuff, and then you just sit back and wait. But if your design is good, then there isn't an enormous amount of work on an ongoing basis, but there is a lot of work up front. So if people want to start something like a food forest, do it right now, because it is going to take time to be able to be productive, and you're not going to have a lot of time. What I would suggest is to try and grow a food forest, but also to grow some annuals and things in the meantime, because that will give you food a lot more quickly than a food forest will. So you start with doing some horticulture and growing some veggies for yourself and things, and over time you actually raise woody agriculture. So you end up with firewood and nuts and fruit and whatever else it is you might be growing. But all of that takes time to put together. And I would suggest incorporating animals into that. I really would. I mean, you don't have to be mean to them. You don't have to eat them or anything like that, but just let them do their own animal thing in whatever way they want.
Could they be
they
like,
can provide ecosystem services.
Could they be pets, so to speak? I mean,
oh, sure.
Not,
yeah, I mean, you can have chickens that are absolutely pets that kids love, and that gives somebody eggs. And it doesn't even have to be you if you don't eat eggs, but you might give eggs to somebody else who does. And in the meantime, your kid gets to cuddle a chicken. Yes, they can be pets. Absolutely, they can. You know, they can be tame. and they don't have to be confined in any way that's unnatural, and they can just eat whatever they would normally eat. So
What would
they're
chickens do
not
it?
being made sick all the time.
What would chickens do at night? I mean, don't you have to build them a coop or something?
It's a good idea. I mean, certainly in a place where, in a rural area, yeah, there would be foxes and stuff like that. So you'd have a chicken coop, but chicken coops aren't hugely difficult to build. And you can make it out of chicken wire or something, but you'd want to make sure that it went down below the ground so that you don't have something digging underneath it. But then absolutely they can be pets. I've seen people, one of my friends on the islands, out, not Vancouver Island, but one of the other islands in that area, Salt Spring Island, that was it. I remember seeing his daughter just sitting there in the living room watching TV, cuddling a chicken on her lap in the house. But kids do these things, and chickens can be really quite friendly. So I think it's something that kids really enjoy. And then the animals get to eat what they're supposed to eat. They get to live their normal kind of life for however long they normally naturally live. So nobody has to do them in. And you get eggs for your neighborhood. So I think something like that would be useful.
And then for communications, like I've heard people saying, well, you could get either ham radio, that's one thing, or actually phones have about, actually I was looking this up, phones have a like a good straight line. If there's no obstructions and they're on their higher transmitting setting, they can actually transmit for like 30 miles. So you could have phones, I mean, if they were within eye shot of each other, that could be communicating with each other. And if each one was acting like a little network, I don't know, peer-to-peer network, and they could communicate directly with each other. And even Wi-Fi, I don't know what the range of Wi-Fi is, but Wi-Fi's got maybe a 100-meter range. I don't know what it is.
I have no idea. But this scenario, what immediately pops to my mind is fires lighting on a series of mountaintops, and then gondola calls for aid.
Huh.
And Rob will answer.
Are you in New Zealand? I think you are. I think you're in New Zealand, Nicole. I can almost hear the music coming up. And if this were a video that were edited instead of just put on the internet raw, then I could see someone putting this in the background.
But yes, I mean, whatever means you have, whether it's smoke signals or phones with eyesight or whatever it might be, there are ways to communicate over distance, and people will find them. And people can set up local networks and things. It isn't something that will necessarily give them access to the whole World Wide Web, but they'll be able to communicate with each other and plan activities and plan chore rotations and things like that.
Nice. Well, I see that my timer went off. I imagine you need to get going.
Yeah, I've got my dentist appointment coming up, so I need to get ready for that because I don't want to be late. They tend to take it very personally if you're even 30 seconds late.
Well, then answer one last question before we go.
Sure.
In this like very, very hypothetical, but possible, I mean, you know, I think about if there's a fire and I think about how to get out of the house. So, and I kind of plan for it, you know, I make sure the door's not blocked or anything. So in this very hypothetical scenario, doctors and dentists?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's going to go back to pay as you go. So I think it's going to be a question of there'll be a doctor who lives somewhere near you and you give him half a dozen eggs and he comes and treats your sick kid with a cough or something like that. So I think right now, pay as you go sounds really scary because the amount of money that it would cost in an insurance-based system would be insane. So the fact that there are insurance companies with deep pockets has pushed up the price of everything. So every aspect of healthcare in the States is vastly more expensive than it is anywhere else in the world. If you take the insurance companies out of the equation, then it will go down to what the market can bear, which will be a lot less. But it'll be a local doctor making house calls, and it won't necessarily be possible to treat sophisticated, complex conditions. that require fancy equipment and fancy surgeries and drugs for a long time and things like that. There will be
so avoiding
problems.
junk
Yes.
food right now, if at all possible.
Absolutely. That is going to be really important. Eat real food. That there's almost nothing more important than that you can do than eat
Like
real
starting
food.
right now, like this minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're eating junk food and you're destroying your health, then you are going to have problems that you're not going to be able to manage. And the system that you have now won't necessarily be there to manage them for you. I'm particularly worried about dentistry. In a way, dentistry is very complicated. I mean, you've got lots of complicated equipment. It uses a lot of energy. You have fancy gutta percha stuff that you have to put into root canals and tiny drills that drill through little tooth roots and stuff like that. I don't think any of that is going to be available at some point in the future. And toothache is pretty unpleasant. I've had a couple of them myself. I have 2 root canals, and I would not have wanted to face that without dentistry and anesthetics. But at some point, people might not have a lot of choice. I seem to remember in the past, people used to tie a string around the tooth that was infected, tie the other end around the doorknob, and slam the door. Things like that.
This whole chat feels like a big red pill to me. So I think if I put this on YouTube, I'm going to have to put a red pill warning on it.
Feel free.
But there's a lot of stuff
by the way, there are books called Where There Is No Doctor and Where There Is No Dentist. So there are books available where you can find out how to treat a lot of things. I mean, it isn't going to let you treat your own cancer or something like that, or narcolepsy or something fancy, but it'll teach you how to set a broken bone and things like that, and how to make sure that you're not dying of dehydration when you get diarrhea and stuff. So there are books around, and they're useful to have, definitely.
There's a lot of also like
go with it too, like bandages and things, first aid equipment, but on a larger scale. It would be a very good idea for people to have a stockpile of first aid type supplies if they have to deal with things like that themselves. And it might not be because there isn't a hospital available. It might be because they don't have any money and they can't afford to go to the hospital. So if the more people can do for themselves, the less dependent they are on money at a time when money will be scarce.
So again, as a red pill, if this whole thing is a red pill, then perhaps it's time to go look for something positive, like on the local Future channel, there's a couple talks about things like how to support each other when you're feeling down. And you and I had that 6-hour chat about, how to face the fear of death and then the unfolding of the future. And we talked about, facing fears, and for 6 hours we talked about that. And then, there's a couple that are like, actually there's a couple, they're kind of relationship talks. There's like a sex talk, and there's, because I mean, if you're still living where you're at, I mean, it's not like certain things change. I mean, you're going to see the same stuff. Like, I'm looking around this room, I can imagine this future 5 years from now, and this room looks more or less the same. So things are going to look the same. It's just going to be what people do that'll be very, very different. Like, they're going to be outside in the garden a lot.
I think so.
And they're going to be helping each other out a lot. And it's going to be like kind of a Mennonite or Amish community kind of.
Yeah. Which is brilliant. I mean, if it works out that way, and it absolutely will in places, not everywhere, but in places it will, those will be the lucky places, absolutely. Because that's what people have to do to get through crunch times. They have to come together and work through it communally.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nicole.
No, you're very welcome.
I'm just going to remind everybody, if you appreciate us sharing stuff like this on the internet, and and Nicole giving her time and Steve giving his time, then please you know, hit the like and the subscribe and ring the bell and put in your email and put in a comment and share it with your neighbors. But remember, it's a red pill. So don't just like send it to people that aren't ready for something like that, mentally capable of taking a breath afterwards. You don't want to freak people out unnecessarily. Some people are just gonna, I mean, if this were to happen, some people are just gonna kind of wake up in the morning, they're gonna be like, where did the government go? Oh, I guess it's gone. I mean, I know there's gonna be at least one person that's like, wasn't this a country?
Yeah, basically. I mean, a lot of people are going to be extremely shocked because they're not aware of any of these things. I mean, they're really not taught in school. Really, any of this is nothing to do with limits to growth is taught. Nothing to do with the way finance works or energy or anything is taught in school. And I think that's a travesty, quite frankly. It's leaving people unprepared for the future that they're going to be facing.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. So did you
Bye-bye.
want to have a chat at 10 o'clock again next Tuesday?
Oh, it's
My time.
Well, here it was 9 o'clock. Oh, you mean 6 p.m. next week for my 6 p.m.
Your time. Yeah.
Yeah, my 6 p.m. Yes.
So what we've been doing up to now is we've been having chats at 10 o'clock in the morning, my time. This one was 1 o'clock in the afternoon because Steve is in a different time zone, and then he would have been asleep at that time. And so we had to change the time to accommodate Steve. But did you want to go back to the time that we had before for the next one?
I'm really tired.
Yes,
it's been a long day.
That's fine. Yep, no problem. We could do 10 o'clock next Tuesday then.
Okay, thank you. But for me, that's 6 p.m. on Monday, Eastern Daylight Time, US. All right.
Yep.
See you later.
Okay, see you later.
Bye-bye.